Hi, and welcome to another episode of Emerald Isle Vacation Home Specialist. I am your host, Dennis Richkovsky. Some of you recognize me as the co-owner of Flip Flops Donuts, and some of you know me as your broker of real estate, specializing in waterfront and water view properties along the Crystal Coast, especially on Bogue Banks and in Emerald Isle, North Carolina. This episode takes us away from the island and to the mainland. Specifically, this episode is all about the Promised Land, which is both an historic neighborhood in Morehead City as well as the site of a new condominium project. The Promised Land is situated between 10th and 15th Streets and goes from the railroad tracks on Arundel Street to Bogue Sound in Morehead City. This neighborhood was settled at the turn of the 20th century when Cape Lookout bankers forged a new life there, as well as on Harker's Island and Bogue Banks. And how they got there to the Promised Land is an interesting story. East of Bogue Banks is a barrier island called Shackelford, and according to Mr. Charles Guthrie, there were 5 villages: Diamond City, Bell's Island, Wade's Shore, Whale Creek, and the Mullet Pond. 75 families lived in these villages, and the livelihood of these folks was fishing, whaling, and hunting. Fishing was done when the fish ran plentiful, particularly in the fall season. Whaling was one of the biggest jobs, and though hard and dangerous, brought good pay. Hunting was done at random by young and old alike, for deer and wild boar were plenty. However, in the late 1800s, hurricanes began hitting Shackelford Banks and these 5 villages with increasing frequency and strength. A series of devastating hurricanes, with the first 2 in 1878, followed by another in 1879, 3 in 1897, and then 2 more in 1899, all hit the barrier island broadside. The maritime forest began dying, the sand began drifting over and killing the greenery. The weather, combined with the decline in whaling, made it difficult for these hardworking watermen and their families to continue living in these villages. Storms and scarcity of whales were not the only factors that contributed to the exit of bankers to mainland communities. Better opportunities for work and education were also factors. Other scarcities like wood for cooking and heating, and the overhunting of game like deer, bear, and waterfowl worked in concert, and the exodus from the banks began. The promise of fresh running water and electricity couldn't hurt either. One of these locations on the mainland was the Promised Land in Morehead City. Settlers floated their houses to their new home sites on flat barges, and some even moved the graves of their relatives from the graveyard on Shackelford to the mainland. To the bankers, it was eminently practical to take their homes with them. They had built them by hand in a fashion to allow dismantling and reassembly. But to Morehead City residents, it was unheard of for an entire community to move to a new location across bodies of water and to take their homes with them over these waters. According to Miss Willis, the bankers also brought with them a dialect and their customs and a lifestyle dictated by their previous near isolation in a harsh world where survival was a constant challenge. Morehead City residents did not understand the way bankers talked, nor the way they did things. They thought that the bankers were illiterate and eccentric, poor people who they didn't want to associate with. So, the bankers learned to survive by becoming a self-sufficient little village called the Promised Land. They built their own church. One member of the Guthrie family started a grocery store. Another became a midwife. They had carpenters, plumbers, and electricians. And how did the Promised Land get its name? There are a handful of theories. One theory says that there was a man named Smith who used to walk home at night slightly tipsy, singing lustily that he was bound for the Promised Land. Another theory recalls that when the poor bankers settled in Morehead City, they purchased their 50 by 100 foot lots from the Shepherd's Point Land Company and promised to pay. The promise was realized slowly, and the businessmen facetiously referred to the area as the Promised Land. The most popular theory, and probably the most accurate, is that the beleaguered bankers who moved to the mainland saw it as a haven, safe from storms, and they compared it to the biblical Promised Land where the Israelites finally found rest. As the boats carrying the thankful bankers and their possessions sailed landward, the people sang the old hymn, "I'm bound for the Promised Land." Regardless of the origin of the name, descendants of these bankers on Shackleford banks do not add the D on the end of the word promise. It always was and always will be the Promised Land. And today, between 11th and 12th Streets in Morehead City, in the heart of the Promised Land, signs went up advertising construction of new townhomes. 6 townhomes to be exact, each with roughly 1,400 square feet of heated living space, 3 bedrooms and 3 bathrooms. The list price for individual units is just under $340,000. These homes will be in a decidedly urban setting, very removed from what the bankers settled more than 100 years ago, what with a very busy road and an active train track a few yards away. Who knows? These townhomes could represent your Promised Land retreat. If you want more information on this new construction project, give me a call at 919-308-2292 and return next week to the same bat channel at the same bat time of 9 a.m. on Thursday for another episode of Emerald Isle Vacation Home Specialist.